Solitary confinement is a broad term for many types of prison isolation and has a complicated connection to mental illnesses. Inmates in solitary are likelier to have or develop mental illnesses, and those who don't can show disturbing symptoms. The modern idea of solitary confinement began at the Cherry Hill Prison, also known as Eastern State Penitentiary, in Philadelphia in the early 1800s. The theory was that the isolation would allow prisoners to think about their crimes and become penitent, which is where the word penitentiary came from. While it varies from prison to prison, prisoners are typically in a single 7-foot by 12-foot cell with the barest of essentials for roughly 23 hours per day. Meals are delivered through a small slot in the door, and except for recreation time and showers every other day, they essentially never leave their cells. An outgrowth of the solitary confinement movement was the super maximum security prison, or supermax. In supermax, inmates have limits on their belongings, including 5 books and 15 photographs, and everything they receive is modified to prevent the manufacturing of weapons. Food has no packaging, and even the pens they write with are simply tubes of ink without the hard plastic shell. Electronics they receive or purchase come in clear cases to prevent hidden contraband or weapons smuggling. Prisoners, on the rare occasions they leave their cells, cannot exit without a full body search and at least 2 guards escorting them. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime has standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, also known as the Nelson Mandela Rules. Rule 43 states that disciplinary actions should never amount to, quote, torture or other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment, end quote, and goes on to explicitly list practices that shall be prohibited, including, quote, prolonged solitary confinement, end quote, defined as longer than 15 days. Seen here are inmates in the Pelican Bay Secure Housing Unit, also known as the SHU, attending a group therapy session with individual cages to isolate them. One likely cruel punishment is Nutriloaf, seen here, which is a meal replacement that provides all necessary nutrients but tastes awful. Solitary confinement practices in the U.S. rarely follow these guidelines. California's Pelican Bay State Prison has over 1,500 inmates in solitary confinement, including 513 who have served over 10 years beyond the 15-day recommended duration. Additionally, many prisons violate or blur the line with regards to many of the other Mandela rules. Those include Rule 45, which bans placing mentally ill inmates in solitary if it will exacerbate their condition, and placing inmates in solitary simply because they are convicted of a specific crime. In California, essentially any gang affiliation or involvement in any gang-related activities is grounds for indefinite solitary confinement. Further rules include having a prison library available to all inmates and placing inmates as close as possible to their homes. In solitary, as previously stated, prisoners typically can only have a limited personal book collection and limited opportunity to renew it. When it comes to location, the creation of supermaxes isolates inmates from their family and makes visiting an arduous process, as the prisons are often far from inmates' homes in more rural areas. For example, the U.S. Federal Supermax in Florence, Colorado, can have inmates from all 50 states, and the SHU at Pelican Bay State Prison is a 7-hour drive from San Francisco and nearly 12 hours from Los Angeles. Part of why solitary confinement is so concerning is how common it is. Estimates place the number of inmates in solitary confinement at roughly 85,000, and many consider that to be an undercount. The rate of incarceration within solitary confinement units is also growing faster than the general growth in incarceration rates. In federal prisons from 2008 to 2013, there was a 6% increase in overall prisoners, yet there was a 17% growth in the number in solitary confinement. This is made even worse by the closure of mental health resources. Since 1970, 90% of mental hospital beds have closed, leaving no choice but to let patients remain outpatients with limited opportunities to ensure they receive the support they need. These patients then commit crimes, and once in prison, treatment is very limited, and those with mental illnesses are likelier to misbehave and be sent to solitary. This creates a self-reinforcing cycle, which drives up the mentally ill prison population, as well as extending the length of their stays. Estimates in 2014 put the percentage of mentally ill inmates in jails and prisons at roughly 16%. Because of all this, the Los Angeles County Jail, Cook County Jail in Chicago, and Rikers Island in New York City have inadvertently become the de facto largest mental institutions in the country. The harmful effects of solitary confinement have been shown repeatedly through qualitative and quantitative data, but direct excerpts from interviews with inmates highlight the true extent and pain of their stays in solitary.
It's like zoo, man, for real. That's exactly what it's like. You see them animals caged at the zoo, that's exactly what the hell it is.
We've got people in here that's been in solitary confinement longer than I've been alive.
If you could put every emotion of the human spirit of hopelessness, pain, agony, hatred, frustration, a sense of continuous silently screaming, all these emotions, and while you're locked in this cage treated like some animal, most people wouldn't even treat an animal like that. An animal who was suffering pain, they would take him to the vet and do something for him.
Like, I had to take a lot of deep breaths before I came in here. Just being around people, it's not awkward. It's a good feeling, but it's still an anxiety feeling because I haven't been. It's like, wow, I'm around free people. I'm around regular people. Thank you for taking your time to hear my voice, because our voices are rarely heard. Okay.
This is a behavior modification, psychological, low-intensity warfare against the mind of a human being. That's what exists here at Pelican Bay.
Large amounts of research have been done into the harmful effects of solitary confinement. A 1998 study by Danish researchers concluded that inmates who spent at least 4 weeks in solitary confinement were roughly 20 times likelier to be admitted to the prison hospital for a psychiatric reason. One foundational piece of research in the field was Dr. Stuart Gracian's examination of 14 inmates in solitary confinement in Massachusetts in 1983. A majority of inmates in that group said they experienced, quote, massive free-floating anxiety and excessive sensitivity to external stimuli, end quote. They reported many other concerning symptoms, including auditory and visual hallucinations, paranoia, and, quote, uncontrollable aggressive fantasies usually directed at guards, end quote. Furthermore, 1/5 of inmates attempted suicide while in solitary confinement. Importantly, very few of the 14 inmates reported having any symptoms of mental illness before entering solitary confinement, and all noted that symptoms eased during legally required breaks from solitary. In 1993, Craig Haney ran a similar study with a similar purpose and based some of his methodology on Dr. Gracian's results. Haney interviewed 100 random inmates at Pelican Bay State Prison's SHU in California. Over 80% of inmates surveyed reported irrational anger, oversensitivity to stimuli, anxiety, lethargy, and difficulty sleeping. 2/3 of inmates reported other common symptoms of various mental illnesses, including talking to themselves, mood swings, and chronic depression. Haney then compared his results to a 1991 psychological study of 20,000 unincarcerated people, and the SHU inmates are 24 times likelier to experience hallucinations, 30 times likelier to experience irrational anger, and over 3 times likelier to experience chronic depression. In 2006, Dr. Gracian published a paper entitled Psychiatric Effects of Solitary Confinement. While discussing long-term post-release consequences, he wrote they could, quote, persist for decades and include persistent symptoms of post-traumatic stress, such as flashbacks, constant hypervigilance, and a pervasive sense of hopelessness, end quote. Additionally, he noted the presence of lasting personality changes and, quote, including a continued pattern of intolerance of social interaction, end quote. Gracian and Haney's studies indicate the development of what they believe to be a clinical syndrome termed SHU syndrome. An analysis of the New York City jail system found self-harm to be associated significantly with being in solitary confinement and mental illness. The authors found that of the 244,699 recorded interactions they reviewed, 7.3% of admissions included solitary confinement, yet 53.3% of incidents of self-harm occurred within that small group. In correctional suicide prevention in the year 2000 and beyond, Dr. Robert Bonner addressed the effect of solitary confinement on inmate suicide by saying, quote, perhaps no factor has been more tragically associated with jail and prison suicides than the consistent finding of isolated and segregated housing of the jail or prison environment." End quote. While progress has been made in reducing the use of solitary confinement, a lot of work still remains in the fight to end the use of solitary confinement.